And so the whole opportunity here is to become aware that there's this whole different way of living your career, which is bumper car moments are going to happen no matter what, because we're human. We're going to run into each other. And when they do, rather than going into a sort of mindless reactive mode where the reptilian brain says fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and you go into all your tap dancing of whatever it is you learned when you were little, it's becoming consciously aware that I don't have to come from this triggered state. I may have some work to do to release my triggered state, but that triggered state probably has a lot more to do with what happened in relationship to people in my past than what's happening with you today.
I'm really excited to talk with you. You just gave this phenomenal opening keynote talk here at the HR Congress World Summit here in Porto. And I'm fortunate, this is the second time that I've seen you give this talk. And every time it's inspiring, it sort of like gets you thinking. And I'm curious, first of all, like this idea of healing at work that I think applies to anyone and everyone. But why specifically bring this to HR professionals?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, first of all, HR professionals tend to want to serve and really help take care of their companies. And a lot of times those of us that go into a helping profession are focused on helping others and not always helping ourselves. I think that's true of a lot of helping professions. And so I think a lot of HR professionals are dedicated to, obviously wanting to do the very best that they can for their companies, which often leads to a lot of workaholism, this whole idea of never feeling like you're doing enough for the business. Like, I really wish I could crack the code on what would really make a difference for the business, and if I can't figure it out, something's wrong with me. And I think that there's this huge opportunity for the HR community to understand their own past experiences and how much that shapes how they experience their relationships today. Having been an HR professional for 36 years, I feel very comfortable in this community, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to help elevate. Part of our conference here is about elevating.
Yeah.
There's a huge opportunity to elevate the global HR community's understanding of how much a person's past can be influencing them at work and how that can actually hold them back from their greatness.
Yeah.
And when we're held back from our greatness, we maybe aren't always in the best position to help our leaders and our business partners that we're working with, our employees.
Yeah. Speaking of the past and HR professionals, you mentioned in your keynote that your upbringing with your family influenced you to become a strong people pleaser, which played out in different ways in your career.
Right.
I would imagine lots of people can identify as a people pleaser, but in my experience, this is something that's very common for HR professionals, right? Who love helping others and want to do anything they can to support other people and not think about themselves. How do you help people identify as this idea of people pleaser? Where does that come from, and how do you sort of deal with that in your career?
Well, it's interesting because I am quite open about being a people pleaser and a perfectionist. And of course, the origin comes from trying to navigate unpredictable dad.
Yeah.
When we're little, we use different strategies to try to create a sense of safety. And I had a belief that if I could just be good enough, then my dad wouldn't scream and yell at me. And if I did something wrong, that I deserved it and I needed to get into trouble. But it was like completely innocent infractions. The childhood brain doesn't understand that this is just a moment, but sometimes feels like a life or death situation, even though that's not what's happening. That the underdeveloped brain of a little person is doing the best it can to make sense of the things that are happening. And so, for me, the origin of the people pleasing was, if I can just get good grades, if I can just be quiet when my dad's around, if I can just always be on time, because not being on time was a big, punishment, then I could create a perceived sense of security and safety. So the limiting beliefs are fueling a lot of this. I'm not good enough. And then that puts us into our strategies, but I'm going to try to be as good as possible by being perfect and people pleasing. And with the hope that it creates a sense of safety. It's part of the role that we create when we're little, to the best of our abilities, to try to navigate a complex, very difficult situation that we don't have any comprehension of what's really happening with our parents.
Yeah. You talk about in your book and your keynote about how so many issues and difficulties people have and so much conflict at work really stems from a past that might involve some type of dysfunction or traumatic events that maybe we don't even realize because we haven't taken the time to really analyze the past.
Right.
And you also mentioned that, sometimes at this point, as you introduce this concept, you get some pushback from people that say, well, my past wasn't that bad compared to others. My life is pretty good compared to others, or why should I even bring up the past? Why do you think it's important for people to start to look into the past?
I do, yep.
Yeah.
I think the reason why this is important and why having clarity and consciousness about the past is it can help us redirect our current experience. And so for me, the past was this fueling of people pleasing and perfectionism. The outcome of those behaviors are workaholism, beating myself up regularly, using unhealthy self-soothing habits to try to take the edge off of not feeling good enough. So you have to look at the costs. What are the costs that you're experiencing, the painful emotions you're experiencing? If I had a boss that looked at me cross-eyed or said something that I thought was harsh, I would spend a week worrying about it. So I think that the reason why it's important to understand these connections is because if we don't, these costs can kill us, literally. And so for me, that's what this work is really all about, is how do I help people actually start to take back the ownership that they're the ones who are in charge of their own self-acceptance. And yeah, we depend on our bosses for performance feedback and compensation and promotions, but they don't get to decide if we're a good enough person. That's our job.
Yeah.
And so for me, the catapulting event is all the misery that people feel. They get worn down from it.
Yeah. Last question for you, for people that are starting to really dig in and think about their past and how that influences things. You mentioned that a couple of it sounds like the first steps are recognizing the impact past events can have, realizing that they don't determine your self-worth, that you are good enough. But then you also said in your keynote, people basically have a choice. You can go down that spiraling path where things just keep getting worse and worse, or you could choose conscious healing when you recognize these, what you call bumper car moments. So how can people choose that conscious healing path? What's the next thing to do?
Yeah, I think it's, again, that realization, like, you know what, I am sick and tired of having a bumper car crash, being really upset and triggered at work, and then going into this spiral downward. And my spiral downward was a daily beating oneself up about what I did, what I didn't do, what I should have done, what I shouldn't have done, and then drinking to try to take the edge off of it. Yeah. And so the whole opportunity here is to become aware that there's this whole different way of living your career, which is bumper car moments are going to happen no matter what, because we're human. We're going to run into each other. And when they do, rather than going into a sort of mindless reactive mode where the reptilian brain says fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and you go into all your tap dancing of whatever it is you learned when you were little, it's becoming consciously aware that I don't have to come from this triggered state. I may have some work to do to release my triggered state, but that triggered state probably is a lot more to do with what happened in relationship to people in my past than what's happening with you today. In other words, if we've had a conflict and I'm really upset about something, it's very likely that my overreaction is being fueled from that past. My job is to process that before I come back into relationship with you. And that doesn't get done a lot. That's what I teach later in my master class, is how do you actually do that?
Yeah.
Part of it's just being more aware. Dr. Bruce Lipton has a quote. He's the author of The Biology of Belief. His quote is something like, even having a new concept in your mind can change how you think and behave. So for me, sharing that spiral down and spiral up that's a new concept. And you can choose. But it's getting clear what the next time you have a bumper car moment, you're not going to go down that spiral down.
Yeah, it's a process. You're not going to change everything in one moment.
No.
But I think as you start learning about it, the process, and you start going through this self-healing, you can also gain more empathy for what other people might be going through, and it can change so much at work. Susan, I know you're helping a lot of people with your book, with your keynotes, the work you're doing.
Thank you.
I so appreciate it. I love getting to talk with you, and I look forward to talking with you more in the future.
Well, you're a wonderful interviewer. I love talking to you too, Andy. Thank you so much for your feedback.